Hello, folks. Today I'd like to bring you guys a bit of a modern, updated Necromantic Aegis guide. I noticed that there wasn't really anything that talked about the state of Necromantic Aegis in 2024. What are some good options? What should you use? When should you use Necromantic Aegis? When should you not use Necromantic Aegis? And so that's kind of what I wanted to go over today, especially considering the big buffs to minions in the patch notes. I know I'm going to be playing Spectre at the start of this league, so I figured that this might be a helpful guide for people who are playing minions in the upcoming league. In this video, I'll put timestamps in the description. That way you can hop from section to section, and you can take a look at some of the meta Necromantic Aegis shield options that are out there. All right, so before we begin, let's talk about what Necromantic Aegis actually does. So it says, all bonuses from an equipped shield apply to your minions instead of you. So this means that all of the defenses, all of the block chance, all of the explicits, everything goes to your minions, and you don't get any benefit from that shield at all. So what works and what does not work with Necromantic Aegis? Let's start off with what works. So first things first, all explicit affixes and all implicit affixes, unless otherwise stated in this list, work. All defenses on the shield apply to your minions. The shield's base block chance applies. Any keystones on the shield apply. Mods that reference you specifically apply because your minions act through the you modifiers when they have the shield on them, basically. They become you. Any corruptions, including double corrupt, and mods that reference allies. Now, if they're nearby you, for example, or any of your other allies, which could be your minions, they can grant benefits to your nearby minions and you through the ally tag. Now, what does not work or what needs additional consideration? Probably the number one thing is Abyss Jewels. Abyss Jewels do not work. If you socket an Abyss Jewel into a shield, the Necromantic Aegis will just take the base stats off the shield. It'll ignore the Abyss Jewels. And by the way, this is how it works as well with Animate Guardian. You can't even attach a Abyss Jewel item onto an Animate Guardian, so these kinds of things, they don't work on any of the minions. Another thing that doesn't really work is mods that specifically reference the player. We're going to look at an example later on with Rathpith, but if it says player specifically, not you and not allies, that is referencing always the player, regardless of if the shield is benefiting the minion. Another thing that doesn't work, skill gems socketed in the shield. You get them, but your minions do not. And in general, your minions cannot cast your spells, and they cannot use any skills or skill effects. So that brings us to the next point, which is that if there's any skill or any trigger that's on the shield, your minions cannot proc those either. Okay, so when should we use Necromantic Aegis? I would say if you're going to use the minion block scaling on the tree where you get the minion block and health back, that's one good reason to use it. But I would say the number one main reason to use it is if you want to get a stat on minions that you cannot get anywhere else. Okay. Another thing, if you're using an Animate Guardian with expensive gear and you don't want it to die, it could be a good idea to use Necromantic Aegis just for a defensive layer. Although I would suggest only that when you're playing softcore, because in hardcore, it's too big of a defense to really give up for the sake of your Animate Guardian, because at that point, you dying is more important than your Animate Guardian dying, but that's not the case in softcore. In softcore, you would rather die over your Animate Guardian dying, that is for sure, especially if you got multiple divines of gear on it, right? Okay, when should we consider using something else, like a minion shield? I would say if the minion DPS on your POB is similar to a +1 minion skills slash minion increased minion damage shield, like a bone shield, you should just use the bone shield because having that block chance is pretty much always better. Another reason is if you're dying often due to a lack of defense, that's something that could be common with Necromantic Aegis because you're giving up all your block, right? So if that's happening, maybe switch from that shield to some sort of rare bone shield, basically. Another thing, if you're playing hardcore, again, I said this earlier, I don't really recommend it for hardcore. There aren't very many hardcore players using Necromantic Aegis, and for a good reason. It's just way too big of a defensive layer to give up, and you probably shouldn't do it, with the very small exception of Maligaros, and we'll go into that in a little bit. And another thing, if the stats that you're getting from the shield are simple, generic stats that can be found elsewhere, such as, percent increased damage, percent increased health, increased attack and cast speed, etc. These are all stats that you can get from other minion gear. You can get percent generic increased minion damage. You can get percent increased minion health. You can get minion attack and cast speed places, right? You don't need to put on a shield to get those stats. So if those are stats that you can get anywhere, then you should not use a Necromantic Aegis setup because you're sacrificing too much defense for common stats. You should only use Necromantic Aegis if you are looking for stats that you can't get anywhere else. And so that kind of brings us to, before we go on to the examples, one more quick note here. The Necromantic Aegis keystone on the tree is connected to this other small cluster here, Decay Ward. It's a minion defense mastery cluster. The notable gives you 18% chance to block attack and spell damage, and you get 2% of their life back on block. And then a small passive leading up to it give 12% chance to block attack. That's one of them. And then the other one gives 12% chance to block spell damage, which means that you get 30% chance to block attack and spell damage with this whole cluster, and minion recover 2% of life on block. So that's actually a pretty significant amount of block and a pretty significant amount of health gain back on block. And so this is a very defensive node for your minions. And so, if you have, let's say you have just even a 25% block shield, that's already 55% block with just those two things, the shield and the Decay Ward, right? All right, so let's take a look at some meta Necromantic Aegis shields. All right, so probably the most meta one right now that a lot of people are using is the Maligaro's Lens. The reason for this is it gives negative 50% to all LE res, and that's useful for minion instability. So minion instability, the way it works is your minions get down to a certain percentage of health, and when they get down to that amount, then they blow up and deal damage. And there's a gem you can use called Infernal Legion, and Infernal Legion causes your minions' health to burn, and so this drops the res on the minions so that they burn faster, and then they proc the explosion of the minion instability faster. And then also they get 1% of minion life when they die. That goes to allies around, so it actually heals everybody else that's around, including you, which is really, really good. And so that's why I was saying earlier, this is like the one exception to hardcore, that this could actually be a decent defensive layer if you have, avoidance and damage reduction outside of this, like outside of the shield slot. You could maybe use this for recovery purposes and damage. So this is kind of viable hardcore. But I think out of all of these, might be the only one that's viable hardcore, and everything else I would say is more or less viable softcore. So what builds use it? Popcorn SRS uses it. Exploding zombies and skeletons use it. And more recently, the Dark Marionette Spectres. These are specters that, when they died, they come back to life. And so that they could just, continuously blow up. Really cool stuff. Nice shield. Interesting use case for Necromantic Aegis. All right, then we have Victario's Charity. This is the Old Faithful. Everybody used to use this back in the day. I would say that this has kind of fallen out of use because it's not as powerful as it used to be. There's easier ways to get frenzy and power charges now. You can get minimum power charges on your shields. So if you wanted that, you might get a minimum power charge rare shield and then get some other better stats on it than what this offers, because there's not really anything else on here that's that great. Just the power and frenzy charges, and then maybe you could use increased area of effective aura skills for some weird minion, but it's not something that's really that popular. So basically the only use of this is to just keep on getting power charges and sometimes, keep on getting frenzy charges and occasionally getting power charges. Although the downside is that this doesn't work on bosses because you need it on kill, whereas the frenzy charge, you get it on hit. So what builds use this? Any generic minion build can use this, realistically. Spectre builds that don't want to sacrifice a Spectre for a Carnage Chieftain, that would be like the main use case, I think, for this. Because otherwise you could just have like a if you needed power charges for some reason, you could have a power charge ape. If you needed frenzy charges, you could have a frenzy charge ape. And that's a lot less investment than an entire shield slot. So yeah. Then also minion builds where minions consume charges. This is very niche. There's some like flicker strike spiders and like discharge specters, but this isn't something that's commonly used, and that's kind of more of like a meme thing. There's a replica version that grants endurance charges to nearby allies on hit and a frenzy charge on a kill. I don't see anybody using this. I think this one is significantly worse than just the regular Victario's Charity. I can't really see any use case for that in Necromantic Aegis build. All right, then we have Lycosidae. This is just a classically good shield. A lot of builds use this in the game, not just minion builds, just because it causes your hits can't be evaded, which of course on minions saves quite a bit of points because maybe you don't have to go down to that like minion accuracy and double damage cluster. You could save like 5 or 6 points, or maybe there's like another cluster you don't have to take somewhere else. So this one, I would say, like, if the builds that would use this are attack minion builds that are strapped for passive points. Maybe if they're like doing some cluster jewel shenanigans and they don't want to be near the like the accuracy node, minion accuracy nodes on the tree, then maybe you could justify using Lycosidae. But I think that there's probably better options out there for those builds, so it's not really commonly used, but it's definitely a possibility, and there's probably a niche build out there that uses it. All right, Qotra's Regulator. I think this is a really cool build. So basically, the way this works is it gives you a very large amount of damage over time multiplier. Now, damage over time multiplier is a stat that you can't get on minions outside of the Aminamu's Jewel. And the Aminamu's Jewel is like often 10 plus divines. And this shield is usually a couple of C because nobody uses it. So this is a good budget choice for those types of builds. So what kind of build uses this? Well, you could do minion self-damage build because it actually causes you to lose life when you deal a crit. That's one use for it. But the main use, I would say, is to use this damage over time multiplier to do Infernal Legion. So basically, you actually have a low crit chance so that your minions don't accidentally blow themselves up constantly. And as long as they've crit once in the past 8 seconds, they get the damage over time multiplier, and then that'll multiply the damage of Infernal Legion. And then with this, you would probably also put minion instability on so that when they inevitably die from critting themselves out, that they explode and you get a little bit extra damage, hit damage as well from that. All right, next one is Rathpith Globe. This is kind of a cool item. Basically, the main stats that we're looking at here are 5% increased critical strike chance for spells per 100 player maximum life. This is what I was talking about earlier. So this used to work on minions. It used to go off of like the user's maximum life, which in the case of Necromantic Aegis is the minion. But then they nerfed it and changed it to say specifically player. So now even when it's Necromantic Aegis, it actually works off the player's life. So you get 5% increased critical strike chance for spells per 100 player life and 5% increased spell damage. So here's how it kind of works out. If you have 5,000 player life, you get about 250% spell crit and spell damage. If you have 7,500 player life, 375% increased spell crit and spell damage, which is a very large amount. Now, with the obvious downside of you sacrifice 10% of your life when you trigger a spell skill, so there's a limited number of minions that can actually make use of this shield without destroying themselves. So I would say like a very niche build for this would be like a life stacking minion build that uses crit minions that you can easily replace. So an example could be something like Skeleton Mages or maybe Absolution. As long as you're like hitting with your own Absolution fast enough to like refresh the health of your Absolution monsters, that could be a possibility. I haven't played this, but this is kind of like a meme build that I might play as like a second build of next league because I just kind of want to try it out. I haven't seen anybody do it, so this is a possibility. Maybe potentially a better option for crit builds, crit spell builds, is Light of Lunaris. This is a really interesting one. So it adds a lot of flat cold damage to spells, which already off the bat is great. Then it has crit chance for spells, which again is great. It has block, which is fantastic. And then it has this line here, 1% to crit chance multiplier per 1% to block attack damage. Now, the thing about minions is that cluster is very efficient at getting block chance, right? And then also there's a line here that says 25% chance to crit multi if you've dealt a non-crit recently. So basically all of these conditions will be up almost all of the time on minions. And so we've got the 25 plus 33 for the chance to block on the shield, plus 30 from the cluster that's next to Necromantic Aegis, bringing us to a total of 88% increased critical strike multiplier, which is a gigantic increase in damage. And then, or 100% increased critical strike multiplier if I invest further into minion block and I get minion block capped, which is 75%. So then it would be 75% plus the 25, which is the 100%. So what builds would use this? You'd probably want some long-lasting spell crit minions, specters, golems. And the reason for that is because it's like, if you've dealt a non-crit strike recently, that's on a crit build. So you want something that's going to be up and like constantly doing damage, not dying, to keep that kind of that buff there up. But even if you didn't have that, I mean, the rest of this is still really good. So yeah, Light of Lunaris is definitely an option if you have a minion that has decent base crit chance, because this provides a lot of multi. Alright, Leper's Alms. I've actually used this in a build myself with Necromantic Aegis. It does 40% increased duration of ailments on enemies. This works really well with poison because increased duration is basically a more multiplier for poison, because there's like an infinite stack of poison on monsters. And there's almost nowhere to get this stat on minions outside of like the skill gems, but like gear wise, that's I think the only place you can get it. So this kind of like goes back to that rule I was talking about earlier. Where it's like if you're going to use a shield for Necromantic Aegis, you should use it on something that is like rare or difficult to get otherwise. And I think this falls into that category. The build that I used was Poison Skeletons. I think Poison Skeletons are very strong. They're still strong. You could play them this league if you wanted to. They'll be good. And they're cheap and easy to get off the ground. I mean, you can do a Leper's Alms with what is that? Severed in Sleep, I think it is. There's like a minion poison blade. You only need that and a poison gem, and you're rocking and ready to roll. And then later on, you can swap out to something better once you get Abyss Jewels with the % chance to poison on hit mod on it. So very, very strong shield. Yeah, highly recommend this one. It also has a line here, Shared Suffering, which is all damage from your hits will cause elemental ailments you are suffering. Elemental ailments you inflict are removed from you. Since basically the only minion build you would use this with is poison, this is kind of a pointless line for us on this shield for Necromantic Aegis, but this is good for other builds. All right, and then we have Power Charge Shields. Now, you can get +2 to minimum power charges on a shield. There's some other really good mods that you can get on shields. There's like a lot of really good shield implicits. One of them is like inflict brittle on enemies when you block. You can get 5% chance to deal double damage, which is a really good mod. Like that's just basically 5% more damage right there. So there are some cases where like Necro Aegis could maybe outweigh a +1 bone shield with like % increased minion damage on it if you have like the right set of mods. The question is it worth losing the like block chance? Hard to say. I think for most cases the answer is probably no. You're probably better off just getting a little bit more tanky on yourself, and you can get a pretty similar amount of damage from other things, so it's not like the best. But then again, it is difficult to get crit on minions. So if you're going all in on crit, then maybe something like this would actually be very beneficial. All right, so that's pretty much it for all of the like semi-meta Necromantic Aegis shields. I'm sure there's probably ones out here that I didn't talk about, but those are the ones that people are using the most and that I've seen builds be made with, and I've I've used myself in some cases. If there's anything else that you think that can be used with Necromantic Aegis that I missed, make sure to message that down in the comments and let me know. I'm always floored by the creativity of Path of Exile players and what they're able to come up with. You know, it's just a deep game that has so many options, and so I'm sure there's lots of things that I didn't go over completely. But I think that that's a pretty good starting point, at least for the Necromantic Aegis Keystone, when it should be used, when it probably shouldn't be used. And yeah, so if you like the video, give it a thumbs up, sub to the channel, trying to get to that 1,000 subs so I can finally monetize the channel. If you listen this far, definitely hit me up with that. Thank you so much, guys, and I'll see you next time.